So Dr. King, so Dr. Quinn Capers gives us a model for really looking at how do we look at, in his original context, these admission decisions. But as I looked at and listened to his video, I hope you found the same kinds of things that I found. That the 5 things that he says that we have to be mindful of admissions actually are the same things that we can apply to both recruitment as well as hiring individuals. And so I want to say thank you, Dr. Quinn Capers, for giving such an eloquent presentation. And so we're going to look at how do we use those same 5 principles to kind of motivate how we think about doing the work of recruitment as well as hiring, as hiring managers. And the real focus of that is to help us illuminate the affinity biases that we oftentimes might have, right? And so when we see people who are like us, we say, yes, and let's invite them in. However, when we see people who we don't think we have things in common with, our natural inclination is to shun them or to not include them in either our project, in our recruitment efforts, or even not even think about them, right? And so when we think about what it means to be effective either in hiring or as a recruiter, it becomes important that we think about those things we have in common with the people that we're seeking to engage. Right? So we're seeking to engage them. And so how do we do that? And so here are 5 principles to think about. One is find commonalities with the group that you're trying to engage, right? So if it's a candidate, if you're undergoing a recruitment strategy, you look for things that you have in common with those folks. And so that's one way to short circuit our affinity bias, is to look for affinities that we might have with a candidate. It's one way to kind of get around this unconscious bias, is to actually look for commonalities that you have with a candidate, even if you don't necessarily see it on the surface. Look deeper, ask questions, probe more, so that you find those commonalities. Next is to gather perspective and try to understand the context by which people are coming to you, right? And so if you're at a career fair, if you are getting resumes in, try to understand what was the context by which these resumes came to you? Like, why are people coming to you? Why are you engaging? What are they after? So do your best to gain a perspective, because what I recognize is once I understand someone's perspective, I have a better understanding of their behaviors, their motivations, why they're engaging me in the first place. And so the second thing is to get a better perspective. Thirdly, consider the opposite. Before reaching a final conclusion, review all the evidence that you have, and look at what if you made a different decision? What if you were wrong? So ask yourself with critical analysis, what if what are the impacts of your conclusion? And so if you came up with a different conclusion, would that add to or take away from how you're developing a team, right? So if we added this person that's a little bit different, what might we gain by doing that? Fourth is identify a counter stereotype, right? So oftentimes, either through society or our own upbringing, we recognize that we place people into archetypes or into stereotypes. And so consider, what if your archetype or your first initial impression was challenged, at least challenge that impression, so that you can come to a more cognitive way of looking at things. And then 5, focus on the primary goal. And so if someone is coming to you, or either you're in a recruitment fair or you're looking at resumes, remember, what is the goal of this? Is the goal of that activity to find someone who is just like me, or is the goal outside of me, right? Does my organization, does my department, does my group need something different than what I might need personally, right? And so if we remember these five things: one, find commonalities with candidates. Secondly, gather perspectives. Third, consider the opposite. Five, identify counter stereotypes. And then number five, refocus on primary goals. So Dr. Koen Capers did an excellent job in really having us think about the admissions process. But I think if we look at that admissions process, we can see some similarities to both recruitment and hiring. And so he offers us five things or five ways to eliminate or override our unconscious bias, right? So one of the unconscious biases that we have is this affinity bias. We want to interact and integrate people who look like us or people who are like us in some way. And so there are five ways that he says that we can kind of short circuit that. So first is look for a common identity connection. The second is to gather perspectives. Third is to consider the opposite. Fourth is to identify counter stereotypes. And five, focus on the goal, right? So when we think about the first one, which is this common identity formation, as you're looking at the other, try to find those commonalities. So if it's a person who went to a different school than you did, or you're just looking at a resume, or you're interacting with an individual, try your best to find, as an observer, as a gatekeeper, so to speak, try to find those commonalities, because the more you find those commonalities, the more you override your natural inclination for affinity bias, right? So find those commonalities. Second, gather perspective. So oftentimes when I'm interacting with folks, and this is why I think it's important not to do interviews by yourself, why it's important to have panels, why it's important to have a checklist, because you want to get information that is somewhat standardized, but you want to check your information against other people's information. We all know that we come from a context and that we have biases. And so to override those, sometimes we need perspectives outside of our own. So the second thing that Dr. Capers suggests is that we gather perspectives from others. So you have your perspective, but weigh that perspective with, including your perspective as you balance that perspective with other people. And then thirdly, consider the opposite. Before reaching a final conclusion, review the evidence to convince yourself of the opposite conclusion. And basically what that is asking us to do is to be a critical thinker. So am I making assumptions when I come with this final conclusion? Am I operating out of affinity bias when I come to this conclusion? Be critical in our thinking. And four, identify counter-stereotype examples. So spend time with people from other groups that you've not been a part of. Identify admirable or admirable characters of a group that you haven't been a part of, and connect with different people from those said groups, right? And so when we think about this counter stereotype, we know that we're inundated through news and media with stereotypes or archetypes of people, but think about, how do you build those commonalities, or what do you recognize about other groups? And then five, focus on primary goal. So is the goal of my hiring, the goal of my recruitment, to get people who are just like me into my organization? Or is it actually to help us advance a particular goal or objective of the organization? And so when we think about this number five, when we think about remembering the primary goal, I may see someone who may not necessarily fit with my learning style or my work style, but they add a complement to the team or to my organization that is missing or that is desired, right? And so the five things we should remember about how do we, kind of override our affinity bias or unconscious bias in recruitment and in hiring is simply, one, Develop a common identity. One, form a common identity formation. So find the things in which make us more similar. Secondly, gather perspective. So use data, information, other people to help you make a better decision. Third, consider the opposite. So if this is true, be a critical thinker in analyzing your decisions. Number four, identify counter stereotypes. So if there is a stereotype about a group or individual, how might that not be true, right? So what are the exceptions? And are those exceptions or are those the rule? And then five, focus on your primary goal. So why are you looking at resumes? Why are you engaging in these recruitment strategies? Is it to find people just like you? Or does your organization have a particular goal in mind?